Welcome to Insights in Sound, where we talk to the people behind the scenes, behind the technology, and behind the music. People you may not know, but you should. And please check out insightsinsound.com for a full list of our podcasts and YouTube series.
From February to June of 1975, I put together the Oberheim 4-voice, 8-voice. Wow. 4, 5, 6 months, something like that.
That's pretty fast for something like that.
I took the prototype to the NAMM show in Chicago in June of 1975. Just being a technician that was working for just the two of us. It was the original prototype, and I showed it there, and it didn't really cause the big stir yet. But I remember in those the days of the NAMM show when actual music store owners would come to the booth,
right.
You know,
and you'd
not
write
like
orders and stuff,
and give you orders, right?
Yeah.
So Henry Goldrich, the owner of Manny's Music, came by and said, "What is this?" "Well, it's a synthesizer." So how much is it? I said, "It's $4,000." He says, "$4,000? There's nothing in my store that's $4,000."
And this was 1970s money, right?
This is 75,
Yeah,
and it's like Les Pauls were $800.
Yeah,
right? That was a lot of money.
Sure.
But the word got around, and I slowly started selling them. And before long, Herbie Hancock had one, and Joe Zawinul had one, and it started taking off, and so I was really in the synthesizer business. And I'd sold them, a lot of them, from the end of 75 through 76 and 77, and they were on a lot of records, and I was instantly an entrepreneur, I guess. That
unintentionally,
and but I thought, well, this is great, you know. I'm selling these things, and my company's making money. But then in those days, the main show, NAMM show, was in Chicago, but they started doing a small NAMM show in Anaheim.
Right.
And in the NAMM show at the Disneyland Hotel in January of 1978, there was a company there I'd never heard of, Sequential Circuits, and they had a synthesizer that was polyphonic, 5 voices.
Oh, so this would have been the Prophet 5.
The original Prophet 5, and it had 2 oscillators and a filter and 2 analog generators, kind of like the SEM in a way.
Well, my first synth was a Pro 1, so I was very familiar with their stuff. Yeah.
And I remember I had a salesman and an engineer or 2 working for me, and they after the NAMM show was over, we went back to our offices in Santa Monica, and they said, "Oh, it's just a polyphonic mini Moog, no big deal."
Ooh, famous last words. Huh?
So as 1978 went by, and they started producing Prophet 5s. They had a few problems at first. It took them a while, but eventually they started selling Prophet 5s. And the Oberheim 4-voice, 8-voice started a steep dive. And
yeah, I mean, Sequential owned the roost for a while there.
That's it. And so my engineer at the time, Jim Cooper, and I said, we're going to have to do something, or we're going to be out of business. So we came up with the idea for the OBX, and we had nothing in the Oberheim line up to that point had a microprocessor in it. So we had to start from scratch and get the equipment to program
Oh boy.
microprocessors.
Uh-huh.
Took a lot of work, and so in about 6 months we developed the OBX. That in 79, 1979, the NAMM show was in Atlanta. I think it was Atlanta. It wasn't in Chicago. It was either Atlanta or New Orleans. I don't remember which. But anyway, so I took the prototype of the OBX to the NAMM show. I had a booth, and the night before, and I knew up to that point that if this wasn't successful, I'd probably have to shut down my business.
Uh-huh.
And so the NAMM show started at 10 o'clock on Friday morning. And this was in June of 79. And we took the machine set up in the booth. And by noon that day, I had $500,000 in business.
Okay.
And again, it took
That's
us
auspicious.
a little while to get the OBX perfected, but that's when my company started growing.
Uh-huh.
And a year and a half or later, we upgraded the circuitry. We found out about the Curtis chips that allowed you to make synthesizer voice with fewer parts, and the OBX-A came out and it did better. And then as the years passed, we did the DMX drum machine, the DSX, polyphonic sequencer, and things were going well until 1985. So we were at the point, let's say early to mid 1980, to where Oberheim was growing about 35% a year. It was profitable every year. I mentioned before the OBX, the OBX, the OBX-A, the OB8, the DMX, DSX, and we were doing well. You know, we were, by the beginning of 1985, we were doing about $1 million a month. So it's like a $12 million company.
That's
and
pretty darn good, yeah.
As we got into 1985, we were, and of course there was also the expander, which was doing well.
Mm-hmm.
And we were working on what became the Matrix 12. The problem I could see I was running into, well, what happened was my sales manager at the time talked to his reps and made an estimate on how many Matrix 12s we'd sell a year.
Mm-hmm.
And we'd done so well up to that point of bringing a new product, getting it in production, and it worked pretty smoothly. I was feeling pretty confident about things. So I made what ended up being a terrible mistake, and I bought parts for the initial production of the Matrix 12 without really getting it all worked out.
Uh-huh.
And as we got into 1985, and they were working on largely the software, but also circuitry of the Matrix 12. We were, number one, buying parts like crazy,
Uh-huh.
and number two, we were running into just normal startup problems with the Matrix 12, and being a very complex machine, this brought us to a critical point by March of 1985, and I could see where the Matrix 12 was going. It's going to take a few extra months. Nothing seriously wrong, just a lot of work, and I could see that the cash flow was going to become a problem. So I went to my lawyer that I'd used since I first started Oberheim in 1970 for his advice, and he said, well, you need to get more cash. And so he suggested that I start working with a bank in downtown LA to get more finance, because I was pretty much maxed out at the bank I was with at the present time then, in March, I think, of '85. And so I worked real hard for 6 weeks talking to this bank that my lawyer recommended. And after 6 weeks, after all of these documents I'd done and projections, they came back and said no.
Oh.
And all of a sudden, we're now at, I don't know, April, I suppose, of 1985, where we had a company at about 10 or 12 million, and we had $3 million in inventory, which is numbers way off.
Yeah.
And so it went from what's the best thing to do to a panic situation.
What are we gonna do?
And my lawyer, to make this, to cut to the chase on this, the lawyer said, "Well, Tom, you're in trouble, and I've got a solution." And to make a story short, basically he suggested that we form a partnership, he and I, and we would go to the current bank, explain the problem, and have them foreclose on the company, and then he would buy the assets, and we'd start back up. And that's basically what happened, except the 50-50 thing never happened. And so in May of 1985, Oberheim Electronics went away.
Ouch.
And there was this new company selling the same stuff. And I think the critical point is, at one point he told my wife Jill, who you just met, that if we didn't do this, we'd lose our house in Santa Monica. So that's what we did, and then, of course, it turned out that was not a good move. And so my company went away. I worked for the new company for a little bit, about a year. I got advice from my patent lawyer, who wondered what had happened to my old company, and he said, well, what your lawyer did is not necessarily illegal, but he shouldn't have done it. So I decided to sue him. My wife and I decided we'd sue him for what he'd done. We couldn't afford a regular law firm where we'd have to pay as we went, because we didn't really have that much money. The house was mortgaged up to the hilt, and we did find a contingency law firm, and we started the lawsuit, and that went on for many months, a year and a half, I think, and in the end, it was kind of a draw. There was a settlement. By the time I paid the contingency lawyers and all the money I had borrowed to pay the court clerk taking depositions, all this, the settlement, I ended up, and then I had to pay ordinary income on the money to the IRS. It ended up being pretty much a draw.
Ouch.
And I had no company and I had no job.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was, let's see, we moved up here. By then it was 1990.
Uh-huh.
And we had moved from Santa Monica. I had to sell a house. I had to, because I'd mortgaged it for Oberheim Electronics, and three mortgages. I had three different loans on it. So
yikes.
We moved to Orinda, and for about 3 or 4 months, every week or 10 days, I'd get in the car and drive down to Santa Monica Court while the process went on getting a courtroom for the lawsuit to begin. And so fortunately, before that happened, the lawsuit was settled, and that was. But then by then I was living in Orinda, had no job, and Oberheim Electronics was gone. In fact, after the settlement occurred, and the stuff belonged to my ex-lawyer, and after a year or two, I don't know what the deal was, because I wasn't allowed to know, but somehow there was a deal between him and Gibson ended up with the Oberheim.
Oh, so it wasn't you that sold to Gibson, it was him.
It was him, yeah. It wasn't no longer my company.
Let's talk about a little bit of the
modern day,
the non-technical stuff.
Oh, okay.
Okay, because there's a few things that kind of fascinate me here. First of all, obviously, as you said, the whole entrepreneurial thing, that's a little bit different for. I think there are people who have in mind, I'm going to be a business person, and they study business, they understand all those principles. Whereas it sounds like you kind of you were more interested in what you were making than the whole business aspect of it, and so a lot of it was kind of learning on the fly, wasn't it?
I think a better way to say it was I was, of course, fascinated by what we were doing, because each machine got better in most ways, mm-hmm. and either me or people working for me came up with ideas for machines, and that was exciting. And we had making more, and of course meeting musicians that loved. It was nice to be praised by a great musician,
right,
about something I'd built.
Right, of course. A creative tool, yeah.
And I really didn't want to be the CEO, but I tried over several years to, I wouldn't say I tried real hard, but I tried to, if I met the right person, maybe, that would have, because I wasn't really good at running a company. Nothing very complicated about it, just I didn't want to do it.
Yeah, and that's, Bob Moog and Roger Lynn, Alan Perlman, so many of these people who were kind of, I don't want to say reluctant entrepreneurs, but accidental entrepreneurs in a way. Same thing happened.
Well, there's a lot of reasons that companies fail. In my case, I just told you mm-hmm. why my original company went away, because mm-hmm. of my lawyer. That was in '85. Then both Roger's first company and Dave's first company, Dave's company, went out in '86.
Yep.
I think they were both better entrepreneurs than I was, but
well, if you ask Roger, he feels he was not a good entrepreneur at all. But yeah.
And there was a big change coming on as we got into the 80s, and it was, well, I think it's easy to say it became the age of the D50 and the M1.
Yeah.
And if our three companies had somehow survived, we would have, at least in my case, I would have had to cut way back, because Oberheims were not gonna sell like they were. I know that, knowing it from looking at it many years later, because the workstation idea was, there's no reason why. Well, the workstation relied on digital technology, I think, pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know enough about the history of the last half of the 80s or going into the 90s, but I know that things changed.
Big time.
And there was a time when analog synths were not at the top of the heap.
Right.
And I struggled on up here in Orinda. I designed a synthesizer that was not successful. At some point in the early 1990s, I realized that I had to do more of my part to paying the family bills. So I just got on the internet one day and got a job in Silicon Valley. Had nothing to do with music at all.
Uh-huh.
And so the next 3 or 4 years, I worked 3 different jobs in the valley.
Mm-hmm.
One was designing traffic light controllers, and one was writing technical, being a tech writer for a startup designing a wild new integrated circuits, and then working for Max Matthews helped me get a job at this think tank run by or financed by Paul Allen called Interval Research,
Uh-huh.
which was it wasn't specifically music, but but then I was, like I say, I was working out of the business, but there started to be this thing called dance music, and first I didn't think too much about it, but I saw Dave get back in the business, and I heard more about it, and more about the phenomenon of the dance crowd using TR-808s that you could buy in pawn shops and
Right.
whatever, and it became a huge thing. I know that Dave got back in it, I think, around 2002, and then
Dave Rossum.
No, Dave
Or Dave Smith. Okay. Because I know Dave Rossum had also left the business for a while and was working in cell phone technology or something.
Yeah, something like that.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. But then when Dave brought out the Prophet 08, it just took off.
Mm-hmm.
And it was clear that analog was coming back.
Yeah.
And of course, things like old Oberheim's starting to sell for more than they had been selling for, and I pretty much considered that I was past my prime to get back into that. But so I did various things in the 2000 time frame. I did some consulting and stuff. And then along, when was it? Around 20, what are we now? We're 2024, somewhere in the 2020 time frame. I heard that, and big news, that a company in England, Focusrite, had bought what was then Dave Smith Instruments, and later went back to being Sequential, and I thought good for him. But then, lo and behold, with Marcus Ryle's help, first of all, of getting my trademarks back from Uli Behringer, Marcus and his wife Sue negotiated a deal where my name was sold to Focusrite, and then was combined with and put into the Sequential division of Focusrite, and So there's now new Oberheims.
Which is kind of cool. Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah, it's very cool.
I want to ask you just, let's do a sidebar for a moment on MIDI. You know, I've had great conversations with a lot of people. I consult with the MIDI Association people as well. I've known Jeff Rona for a long, long time. And of course, I've known Marcus for a while as well. The early days of MIDI, I know you were a proponent. There were a few people who were sort of holdouts, including Bob Moog, Tom Ray, a few other people. And what was your part in all of those sort of negotiations and forming of that?
Okay, first of all, when I got into building musical electronics, 69, 70, I was absolutely, totally, completely burned out on digital stuff because in the 1960s I had probably designed 5 or 6 digital systems that weren't truly computers, but then in the 65 to 68 time frame I designed 2 general purpose computer systems, one of which was actually built, where I designed the computer part, which was designing the instruction set. This is before chip. This was long before the first Intel.
Yeah, 60
little
or mid
Intel
60s.
chip. That was in the early 70s. This is in
Sure.
65. This is 64, 65. I had designed quite a few digital systems. Started with this little company that I went to from NCR that allowed me to go to school and go back and forth to work and school and work, you know, and I designed a bunch of systems for them. Then I moved on to another, after I got my degree, moved up to another, or just about the time my degree was done, another computer systems company where I still didn't design an actual computer, but I built a couple systems that were basically trigonometric computers that use a special algorithm. But then, in those days, digital system engineers were in demand, and so I always kept getting calls from this headhunter. And I think this is 65 maybe. And I said, okay, I wanted to get rid of him. I said, so you find me a job where I design an actual general purpose digital computer, and I'll be interested. I thought that'd get, because that's not what you know, not everybody in the computer design business designs the actual computer.
Right.
So you called me once and said, I got a job, it's for you. And sure enough, this company in Newport Beach was designing a special system. They didn't necessarily think that they needed to have their own computer designed, but the place was, or 3 older veterans of the electronic systems business, and 3 young engineers, me and 2 other engineers. And we both, the 3 of us, knew that the best thing to do here was to do a regular computer. And there was nobody making a mini computer. There were several mini computer companies, but nothing would work for this application. So the 3 young guys talked to the 3 old guys and said, let's build our own computer. We can do that. And so my job was just, with the other 2, design the instruction set, and then they were both software guys. So I designed the complete hardware of this 24-bit mini computer. Best job I ever had. I had more fun than
in
ever.
1965, you designed a 24-bit computer. I mean, that's pretty impressive. Wow.
Of course, in those days, it was core memory, but there were companies that made core memory systems.
Yeah.
And I love that job. Oh, that was a great job.
Uh-huh.
And why did I get onto this subject?
Because we were talking about MIDI.
Oh, yeah. So in the 11 years that I designed digital systems, when I started out in 59, I meant 59. I designed time code generators and a system. It's called a computer, but it controlled a machine that developed or produced rocket fuel tanks.
Wow.
That went to France, and I got my first trip to France out of that, and just all kinds of systems, including this one system where I designed all the logic, and some of the instruction set. Loved that job, and then I designed 2 other computer systems that were never actually produced, but I did all the design. And so when I started building ring modulars and phase shifters, I had it. I was burned out. I didn't want anything to do. Now, I did do my digital sequencer because it was totally fun. It was just, it was before microprocessors, so there was no computer to program. It was just what we called AND gates and OR gates.
Right.
And I loved that. I loved that project,
Yep.
and it was fun. But other than that, I did not want anything to do with digital. So when MIDI came along, I had people working for me by then, and I said, you guys do that. I don't want anything to do with MIDI. I don't want anything at all to do with MIDI. I don't, the only thing I ever, now by then we had, at Oberheim, we had the DMX, DSX, and the OBXA, and we could put them all together and have what we called a system.
Right. But it wasn't via MIDI, it was your own proprietary system.
Before any talk of MIDI.
Right.
But the problem with that system was that you had the audio of the synthesizer and the audio of the drum machine, and it was a digital bus. It wasn't MIDI, but it was a digital computer bus that also went to these machines, and totally impossible ground loops.
Oh, sure, of course.
And we tried many different things. We did eventually solve it, but when MIDI came along, I really didn't have any interest in it. I had a couple guys that could handle all that. But I did look at it, and I noticed that somewhere along the line, I don't know if it was Dave and his people or the Roland people. I think Dave said it was the Roland people.
Kakahashi was the one who was really pushing it, I think.
Yeah.
He was
along with Dave,
the band leader.
And
He
somebody
and Dave,
I think Dave told me, somebody at Roland suggested, and MIDI put it in the spec, of the thing called a opto isolator.
Right.
And that solved the horrible ground loop problems we had. But so MIDI became something, started to happen. I absolutely didn't want to know anything about it. The engineer that worked for me was writing a MIDI column in Keyboard Magazine. I didn't even want to look. I didn't even want to read. I didn't want to read the spec. I didn't want to know about channels, and I just didn't want anything to do with it. But one day, I don't know if it was a NAMM. If it's after a NAMM show, but Tom Beckman of Roland and Dave Smith asked me if I would meet them somewhere in LA. And what they were concerned about is that if they were talking about forming the MIDI, a MIDI association.
Right, the MMA.
And what became the MMA. And if Roland, somebody at Roland was helping, making it happen.
That would have been Jeff Rona, I believe.
If somebody at Sequential, then people might say, well, there's been a conflict of interest here.
Uh-huh.
So they asked me if I would be the president. So I was the first president of the MMA. I couldn't make myself look at a MIDI implementation chart. I couldn't make myself look at the MIDI spec. I had nothing to do with MIDI, but I ended up in the history books as something to do with
So
MIDI.
you were a reluctant first president.
I didn't, absolutely reluctant, absolutely. And I did it for a year or so, and just some mechanical stuff.
But yet you did see the promise in it, even if you didn't want to be bothered with the actual implementation.
Oh, we already
right?
had the system, what
Sure.
we call the system.
That's what I'm thinking,
Absolutely.
is you already had this.
And I admired it because Dave had given an AES paper on an earlier idea that a lot of which became MIDI, and I admired the design of it because it was pretty economical. And had this, of course, this thing I was happy to see was this opto isolator. And it was clear that it was a well thought out thing, especially because things were pretty expensive in those days if you had a microprocessor and all that stuff. So
Sure.
it was economical. I thought it was well done, very well done. I just didn't want to have to do anything about it. I didn't want to be
Okay.
involved with it.
And yet your name was all over it in that sense,
Well, I didn't.
by proxy, so to speak. Yeah.
I personally had nothing to do with it.
How funny.
Now, as MIDI started to happen, on just the basic, note on, note off stuff, we were working on the expander, and so there was a meeting at Oberheim. I think it was basically arranged by Marcus, where several engineers and some other engineers that I don't remember who it was now, because the expander had quite a complex MIDI implementation. And of course it changed everything.
Sure.
I mean, even now, just a laptop and a MIDI an interface. You go out in the forest and score a movie.
Yeah, I mean it's beyond
Maybe.
anything anybody ever expected, and of course, now there are virtual instrument companies making faithful reproductions, in fact, of your 8 voice. The folks at Cherry Audio are doing some really wonderful stuff. I mean, the stuff that we could not have even imagined in our wildest dreams. Yeah,
It's wonderful.
which. Okay, and you know what? That brings us around to a nice way to wrap this, because this is a question that I frequently ask my guests, and particularly in your case, it would be really interesting to hear your take on this. You came up in a very, very different era, not just technologically speaking, but in terms of the industry itself. The industry has, I wouldn't even say evolved at this point. It's almost, it's unrecognizable from what it was back then. If you were looking at 15-year-old you coming up in today's world of technology, music technology and everything, what would you tell them besides run, hide?
Oh no. However, I know well I can't predict where the musical electronics industry is going, but in the comfort of being retired, I see other industries. If I was a young engineer, I'd go crazy over. Recently, the FAA gave a blessing on what some people consider a new type of device that goes through the air. And then we've got airplanes, helicopters, although they have fancier names for those, what are the group of things called airplanes, and
Right.
a group of things called helicopters,
Right.
and whatever. And that is these devices that you get in, they go up like a helicopter, and then they traverse like an airplane, and then they go they're calling that a whole new field of flight.
Sort of like a hovercraft kind of thing.
Well, they can hover, but they're not. But they can fly like an airplane, and that business is booming.
Uh-huh.
Now it probably will be another couple decades before you see it. Somebody has one in their driveway. So that looks really interesting. Then another thing that hinges a little on my computer career, and that is impossible for me to understand, and I don't have the math necessary to understand it, is what's called quantum computing.
Yeah.
And I've got a couple books on it that I can read a sentence or two a page and understand, but it's still interesting. But as far as music is concerned, I think you have to have you have to start with a certain passion that you're not going to be able typically to go to a musical instrument company and be creative in this day and age, not like it was when Dave and Bob and I started, where just the basic, the simple stuff that we did in the early days was in demand.
Right. That ground has already been broken, so to speak.
And the company's dominated now by larger companies.
Yes.
Of course. So now that doesn't mean that won't happen. I mean, the new companies come along and do things, and it's amazing to see it, like UDO, if you've seen their stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
Beautiful equipment that really doesn't involve some new breakthrough in technology. It's just a very artistic, semi-artistic, semi-technical combination of energy. It's great stuff. There's a lot of stuff like that.
Well, the user interface stuff is really fascinating now. Some of the alternative stuff, the alternative controllers and everything. Back when Don Buchla was doing it, we thought it was kind of crazy, but now a lot of these younger companies are coming up with stuff like that. So I think that could be, sort of a new forefront.
That could be, yeah. But just taking it from the point of view of a young engineer and not considering music or whatever, there's just a lot of stuff happening, and I think it's very exciting. If I was a young engineer, I'd be tempted. But of course, for the most part, these endeavors require, you just can't go in and say, I don't have a degree yet, but I love it.
Right, you can't do that anymore.
You got to have a doctorate in some of this stuff.
Exactly. But now in your case, the thing about it was that you were not only fascinated with the technology aspect of it, you were fascinated by music because you had been drawn into music. So is there a future in music
the technology wasn't a big, because the technology that got me started was
not musical at all.
Well, it took a while in the case of the ring modulator, to see how it could be musical.
Right.
But certainly as I saw people start to experiment, but it was in fact the technology in, for instance, the stuff that Sequential's doing, that's now kind of navigating over into the Oberheim area, because it's all one company.
Right.
That has some hardware aspects, but the big thing is in the software.
Of course.
You know, if you open let's see, open up an OBX, OBX, OB8, OBXA, you lift the cover, and it's pretty much the same situation. The circuitry takes the whole space. Now you open up the cover. Oh, and then you got a circuit board here, maybe another circuit board underneath. You got this circuit board.
Motherboard, a daughter board, and all
of
these.
this.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Now you open up an OBX8 that Sequencer came out with a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. It's one board about this big.
Right, and the rest is all empty space, basically.
And it's empty space.
Yeah.
And that's a result of semiconductor technology.
Right.
You know,
right.
They're smaller. They do more. You've got chips that do things a million times or thousands of times faster than the 24-bit machine I did in 1965.
Yeah.
And that's interesting. And that's
Mm-hmm.
That takes some knowledge and or experience. So you don't walk into it like I walked into it.
Do you think that there is still a place for passion-driven entrepreneurship?
Oh yeah. Oh well. There's passion for making instruments. So
Mm-hmm.
That's
what
for
drove
sure.
you, right?
The passion didn't come first. When I
Interesting.
did the first ring modulator and then later the phase shifter, it was it was a pedal thing.
Right. Uh-huh.
And I'm not overly impressed with pedal stuff technology. Although some of them have some pretty interesting DSP now in them.
Sure. But it must have been thrilling to you to have...
It was when a machine that was an instrument that you could play, and it was played by a person who was a great musician. That's when the passion started.
Okay. Uh-huh.
I love telling the story of... I've told this story many times, but so I first met Joe Zawinul when he was playing keyboards with Cannonball Adderley in the early 70s.
Wow. So well before the Weather Report. Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, this before just before Weather Report, and he had, just like some other people, Jan Hammer and a few others, had bought a ring modulator that they used with their Fender Rhodes piano.
Right.
And so I knew Joe, and I had met him once when he was on tour with Cannonball Adderley. We discovered we had the same birth date. He was 3 years older than me.
Uh-huh.
Then things got busy, and the 4-voice and 8-voice were in production, and I was working my tail off, trying to keeping that happening. And I got a phone call, and it's Joe, and he said, Tom, I bought one of your 8-voice machines. And this probably was 76 or 77. And I said, oh, that's great, Joe, because by then Weather Report was happening, and
Mm-hmm.
the early stuff, the earlier Weather Report stuff.
Uh-huh.
And he said, well, I'm living in Pasadena now. Could you come over and show me a few things on the 8-voice? I just, sure. So I went over to his house. He had this nice house just above the Rose Bowl.
Mm-hmm.
And I sat down with him, and not knowing any better, engineering, and said, "Oh, Joe, there's the VCOs, and they mix into. Then there's the mixer that goes into the VCF, and you've got the cutoff frequency and the resonance, and you do. Then you got the envelope generators, and attack time and decay time. It's like."
I'm thinking he's just kind of glazing over, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
But he's very nice about it. After a couple hours, he thanked me, and in those days, I was living in Santa Monica, and I had my little red Alfa Romeo sports car. And I drove home and went back to work the next day, figuring, well, he'll probably just take it back to where he bought it and get his money back. And 4 or 6 weeks later, he calls me and said, Tom, you got to hear this, the sound I got on your synthesizer. I said, I'm thinking, what? I figured it was just all over. So I drove back over to Pasadena, and he played me a rough mix of Birdland.
Oh.
And hearing that, that pseudo big band sound, it's like, and I never spent 1 penny on any dope, but I did smoke marijuana when I was offered it, and we had a spare, we shared a joint, and he gave me this cassette of this rough mix of Birdland, and and of course I was totally blown away. I mean, you can't imagine how crazy that was.
Well, just musically, in general, it was
Oh, it was a great
groundbreaking.
tune. Plus,
it's mine, right? It's my baby.
That's my synthesizer,
Yeah.
making that sound.
Uh-huh.
So I drove home and I played that cassette over and over and over. Then the next day, I got up to go to work and get in my car and I turn on the thing. Turn out, as I drove home, the volume got louder. And then I just turned the car off when I got home.
And the next morning, it scared the hell out of you, right?
The volume turned all, wow. So that's one of my favorite stories.
But I can imagine that really kind of ignited a passion that, I mean,
oh God,
yeah, that's like, oh my God, what am I doing, right?
And then little by little, other people would do stuff that was just, I never envisioned would be something that I built that would sound so wonderful.
Yeah.
And that's when the passion started.
Mm-hmm. Tom Oberheim, thank you for being my guest.
It's been great, Daniel.
It's been a pleasure.
Loved
Thank you.
it.
Hey, I'm Daniel Keller. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join us each week for Insights in Sound.